Welcome to this week's edition of Focus on Connecticut. I'm Tom Appleby. Our guest is the congressman from the 4th District here in southwestern Connecticut, Jim Himes, Democrat. Good to have you with us.
Great to be back, Tom.
We try to have Congressman Himes every 3 or 4 months and keep up to date on what's going on in Washington. And I want to point out that we're taping this on the Friday before Memorial Day. Congressman Himes was sitting on the tarmac in Washington until about 2:45, and so he's here on a few hours sleep because we taped this Friday morning.
A big cup of coffee.
And we'll keep it coming if you need it. But thank you for the extra effort. We appreciate it. So you were there an extra day, actually, because usually you come home on Thursdays to vote on the Patriot Act, the extension of the terrorism bill. And you voted against it this time.
Yeah, in fact, the entire Connecticut delegation voted against it. More and more members of Congress are voting against the Patriot Act. And the reason for that is that, the Patriot Act was passed shortly after 9/11 when people were really emotional and very scared, and you understand that reaction. But there's not a lot of dispute that a lot of elements of that act actually encroach very significantly on our civil liberties. The government can ask not just for a specific thing, to go into your house to find a specific thing. They can ask to go in and take anything under what's called the any tangible thing doctrine. They can also, under something called national security letters, and they've done tens of thousands, 40, 50,000 of these national security letters, simply write, without judicial review, a letter to your internet company saying, we want to see the records of this individual's internet use. And so it just goes too far. And in my first term, I voted for it because they said, look, we'll fix it, we'll have a conversation, and we'll make sure we balance liberties. Since then, they brought it up for reauthorization with no change time and time again. And so an increasing number of us, me included, is saying, you know what, our civil liberties are what this country is about, and we need to get this right, and that's why we.
It's interesting because I remember when the act came out, asking our lawmakers at that time about civil liberties, and they would look at me like, well, what are you thinking? We have to worry about the country and how the 10 years has changed things. But this is coming from the president on down. This is a president that many people thought would have a more liberal agenda.
Well, the president, of course, oversees the agencies, the FBI and the CIA and others who are doing the investigations and stuff. So they obviously, like any president, have a natural instinct to defend the powers of the executive branch. And as the founding fathers intended it to be, it's the job of guys like me in Congress to say, wait a second, we should really take a stand for the liberties and the freedoms that are at the core of what this country is all about. And that's what this debate is about. So hopefully what we see is, I was also disappointed by the way the Patriot Act was renewed now for 4 years. This wasn't, let's do another 6 months and then have that conversation. It's 4 years. So this was the right vote in favor of the Constitution.
Well, one of the things you were voting on was the right of the government to look at people's library records.
Right.
I expect there are plenty of people out there saying, hey, I got nothing to hide. Go ahead and look at my library. If it's going to make my family, my town any safer, go for it.
Well, that's an instinct, right? But I think that's the wrong instinct. That assumes a benevolent government, right? That assumes a government that won't abuse those rights. But you can't assume that. You can't assume that. In fact, shortly after 9/11, an awful lot of the techniques that were used by the security agencies were subsequently deemed entirely unconstitutional by the courts. You had the FBI refusing to undertake some of the things that they were ordered to. So if you believe that the government's always going to be benevolent, then okay, maybe. But look, this country is founded on liberties, and somebody needs to take a stand and say, no, you know what, we're not going to buy into this false trade-off between security and liberty. We're going to stand for those things that make this country this country.
So this is now on the back burner for 4 years. This will not be a discussion between now and then?
Well, we could always, bring it up again, and I hope we do. This is a terribly important conversation about the balance between our liberties and what we're willing to give up in the face of new threats and whatnot. So Congress could, a year from now, decide to revisit that law, but if we don't do that, yes, the Patriot Act, unfortunately, as written right after 9/11, in a very emotional time, will be the law of the land for 4 years.
Talk about what you can and can't give up. This brings us to the Israel question, because the president came out saying Israel needs to give up some things if there's going to be peace in the Middle East, and the United States wants to see them go back to the border borders of 1967, before they gained property in a war. And the Prime Minister came to Washington, spoke to Congress, and a very positive response from our Congress, saying we're not going to give up, we're not going back.
Well, Tom, it's really important we get the facts right here. If we learned anything in the last week, it's that the words really matter here. And what the president said was borders based on 1967 with mutually agreed upon swaps. So when Israel has a settlement with 20,000 people in it across the line, obviously 20,000 people are not getting up and moving. And this has always been the principle under which negotiations have happened, and both sides recognize that. Look, in any negotiation of any kind, people recognize that you come to the table and you're going to give up some stuff. Unfortunately, look, almost everybody believes in a two-state solution with a safe and secure and Jewish Israel. The question is, how do we get there? And what worries me is that we've taken some steps backward. When the Palestinian Authority, in whom many of us had a lot of hopes, they were working with General Dayton, their security services were getting trained by Americans, you were seeing construction in the West Bank, then they turn around and they do a deal with Hamas, a terrorist organization that celebrates attacking an Israeli school bus. All of this wording, which I know is important, I just don't know how you get over that. So, we've got huge obstacles. One of them is not that we don't all understand that there's going to be sacrifices and trading done at the negotiating table.
We're going to take a brief break and we'll continue with this train of thought in just a sec. Stay with us. Focus on Connecticut. I'm Tom Appleby, talking with Congressman Jim Himes, taping this a week in advance of this discussion. And there was a local angle to Netanyahu's speech in Congress.
That's right. I mean, what a neat thing. We had Rabbi Wiederhorn, Jeremy Wiederhorn of Westport, who gave the opening prayer the day of the Prime Minister's speech. So he got to meet the Prime Minister, and he sat with me in the chamber when the Prime Minister addressed the joint session. So it was kind of a neat local angle on a historic event.
Continuing the Westport angle, I heard Alan Dershowitz, a Harvard law professor who was very outspoken on Zionism, speaking in Westport a few weeks ago, and he said, much as Israel welcomes the United States' support, it cannot count on it, that Israel cannot afford to count on anyone, really. It must assume that it stands alone. Do you agree with that?
Well, not really. I mean, look, the United States recognized the state of Israel about 4 minutes after it was declared in 1948, and since then we have been a steadfast supporter of Israel, and many of us in Congress, think about making sure that we provide for the security and safety of this very important ally of ours. But, at heart what he says is true, right? No country would ever say, hey, we're not going to worry about our own well-being because we're going to trust this other country. So, I think that perhaps the way he phrased it, understates the support that this country has given to Israel. But look, Israel is surrounded by some very significant threats: Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah. Under those circumstances, you don't take anything for granted.
Not far away is Libya, and we're involved. The 60 days before which Congress needs to jump in if there's any kind of war going on has passed. We're still there. There's talk of, from a Connecticut senator no less, that we should get more involved, perhaps provide a little more aid.
Yeah, Tom, I just couldn't disagree more. I had a lot of concerns with the president's decision to jump into Libya. I'm a little muted in how I express those criticisms because subsequently we now know that had the U.S. not acted, there'd probably be tens of thousands of people who are alive today who would not be. So I'm going to be a little quiet on my criticism of the president's decision. However, the last thing this country needs is to be militarily involved in yet another country to spend the money, and we've already spent close to $1 billion in Libya, $1 billion. And of course, if we get more involved militarily now, instead of just reading those casualty lists from Iraq and Afghanistan, we will start to see American soldiers lost in Libya, and that is not where this country needs to go right now.
So provide support, provide weapons, no people.
The cause against Muammar Gaddafi is just, but there is a higher standard than that for us committing our troops, right? So yes, the answer is let's do everything we can. Let's impose sanctions, let's apply pressure, let's organize other people in other countries to do the fighting. The way NATO is operating right now, we've been the world's policeman for a very, very long time, and it's time for other countries to step up because it has been our young men and women and our taxpayer dollars that have been policing the globe for too long. So yes, we should do everything, but I will not support an increase of our military presence in Libya.
So is this the time for Congress to step up and say, no, we make the call here, not you, President Obama?
I think it is. And again, you know, if you look back over the last 50 or 60 years, when this country has drifted away from what is very clear in the Constitution, which is it is the Congress that declares war, we should move back in that direction. Look, if we're under imminent threat and the president needs to act in a matter of hours, by all means act. But if you think about Vietnam, if you think about Iraq, if you think about Libya, all of those conflicts were gotten into, and I think we regret at least 2 out of 3 of them, without much congressional participation and oversight. And so I'd like to see us move back to a world where the Congress, the representatives of the people, are more involved in these decisions.
When you refer to 2 conflicts, I'm going to talk about those right after this break, namely Iraq and Afghanistan, and whether it's time already that we got out, something you ran for office on. We'll talk about it in a second. Welcome back to Focus on Connecticut. I'm Tom Appleby. Our guest, the congressman from the 4th District here in southwestern Connecticut, Jim Himes, Democrat. And just a note that we are taping this a week in advance, just in advance of Memorial Day, as a matter of fact. Iraq, in the last week or so, outgoing Defense Secretary Gates said, well, if American troops just should happen to hang around in Iraq a little bit longer than was expected, it may not be such a bad thing, particularly in light of Iran.
Well, yeah. Look, we have been withdrawing, and I think the number is now 100,000 of our troops that have withdrawn from Iraq, and that's the right thing. There comes a time when you have to turn a country over to the people and to the security services of that country. And look, I don't think we ever should have been in Iraq, so the sooner the better. But, you know, having broken the place and having sort of, you know, created an environment of some uncertainty, I do think we've got a residual obligation to keep some people there to train their security services. But I don't think we should have permanent bases in Iraq. I think that will cause us problems. Not in any way to undersell the Iranian issue, but you know, again, it is time for us to continue our withdrawal, not just from Iraq, but to begin a meaningful withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Before we get to Afghanistan, you got 45,000 American troops in Iraq right now. Do you have an idea of what a training level would be? Significantly lower than that. Mm-hmm.
And you know, we're not doing combat operations anymore in Iraq, but 45,000, of course, is more than training, more than advisors. And so, again, I think we should, you know, keep enough people there to continue to train their people. And frankly, I don't know if that number is 2,000 or 10,000, but it's not 45,000.
Afghanistan. You want out of there as well.
Yep. You know, I was in Afghanistan a little over a year ago, and you know, we saw 3 weeks ago when our military tracked down and killed bin Laden where our problem is. It's in Pakistan. So my point of view is that the mission that we're undertaking right now, which nobody likes to call it this, but this is what we're doing, of nation building in Afghanistan, of working with local councils, building roads, helping farmers. I don't know if that's going to work, but it's not what we should be doing. We should be focusing on Al-Qaeda and the bad guys that are in Pakistan. So what that means is, let's stop fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan. They're very bad people. No question they're very bad people, but they're not the people who brought us 9/11. And let's keep just enough presence, enough bases in Afghanistan so that we can do what we're doing very successfully, which is operate through drones and other covert means and just keep a presence there to go after the bad guys that we know are in Pakistan. That's the mission we should be doing. I imagine there are people at home saying, enough with overseas. Let's worry about the bad guys here. And one of the areas where we saw a lot of bad actors, bad characters, was in Wall Street. And now we're starting to see a whole new wave of bad characters, and these are the insider traders. What can we do about this, aside from each prosecution that we're doing? Well, we should go after them. We should go after them just the way the prosecutors seem to be doing now. You're hearing more and more of prosecutors going after guys who clearly broke the law. And that's an important thing to do. People need to know that if they break the law, there will be consequences. Americans need to know that people who are taking advantage of them will be brought to justice. What's a tougher thing, Tom, is all of the mess that got us into this economic downturn. You know, all of the lousy mortgages, the lousy credit ratings, all that stuff. The horrible thing about that is that behavior was not illegal. illegal in many instances, right? So yes, go after the bad guys who break the law. We should do that anywhere at any time. But we spend so much time, and as a member of the Financial Services Committee, I spend a lot of time thinking about how do we make sure that all of those things that got us into this mess, many of which were not illegal, don't happen again.
And are we any closer, do you feel, now than we were 3 or 4 years ago when this all started to crumble?
I think we are. Right now in Washington, they are setting up a Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. The idea is that, the government wisely won't let somebody sell you a toaster that will blow up and burn down your house. Government should probably step in and keep someone from selling you a mortgage that they know you're not going to be able to repay. That is going to take down your house in a different way, right? So there's that. Banks will be subject, and they're not happy about this, but banks will be subject to a lot more regulation. Some of their riskier activities will be curtailed. For hundreds of years we've seen financial bubbles, so I'm not going to sit here and tell you that we fixed the problem, but we will be operating in a very different world than we were operating in the 90s when it was just
Wall Street had its own oversight organization, and that didn't seem to do much.
Yeah, no, not only did Wall Street's own oversight organization do much, but another piece of this is the fact that the SEC and the FDIC and the Federal Reserve missed this. Shame on them. And a big part of the Dodd-Frank effort is to make sure that that doesn't happen again. Imagine, this, but Americans, seeing, Wall Street making tons of money, and then when they make mistakes, everybody else pays the price.
Yeah. One last break, and for all those people out there saying, I don't care about any of this, I'm worried about my health care. They're going to take away my health care. We'll talk about that in just a second. Stay with us.
Get my girls doing
Just a few minutes left with Congressman Himes. Medicare is on the table. There's a lot of talk about changing it. Should we?
We will. And we have to. We don't need to do it immediately. We certainly don't need to do it the way the Republicans have proposed, where they would basically just hand our senior citizens a voucher and say, go buy health insurance from the health insurance companies. But look, Medicare in the long run will be in trouble. In 2026, it'll run out of money if we do nothing. But instead of what the Republicans are proposing, which would change Medicare beyond anything that anybody has ever seen, it would privatize it, it would really put our seniors at risk, we need to continue the effort that we started with the health care reform bill of saying, let's take this incredibly inefficient system, and it's inefficient, right, because we're spending two times per person what every other industrialized nation spends and getting worse results on average. Let's take that inefficiency out of the system. That means we're going to be able to provide the kind of benefits that so many Medicare recipients have come to know and love. That's the way to address it.
I'm going to take us back to terrorism for just a moment, because southwestern Connecticut got hit with the news that the money that we expected to get from the Homeland Security people isn't coming anymore. It's been cut. Primarily, this hits us in terms of our communication system that we were setting up so that all of the organizations could talk to each other. Is this just a snub? Is it a political move by someone?
No,
Why
it's
us?
not. It's not a political move. And it's important that we don't scare people on this, right? We're talking about a very small grant program that was used, to add a couple of $1 million to spending in this region, which is much larger than that around our security. So I don't want people to be too worried. But it was the wrong thing to have happened. What they did was they said, okay, 40 cities, urban areas used to be eligible for this. Now we're going to take it down to the 10 most at-risk urban areas. Well, I think that decision was a bad one, because we are right outside of New York. We have some special needs with respect to security.
Well, people saying we had the Times Square bomber in our backyard.
Exactly. Now, remember, the Times Square bomber was caught, and the FBI came up here and did their thing, and that was good. The coda to this, though, is, and I spend my life listening to people saying, cut the budget, cut the budget, cut the budget. Right, we got to cut the budget, but understand that when we do that, this kind of thing will happen. I keep telling people, and we all know we need to cut the budget, but this kind of stuff is what that means. Lots of things that we believe to be terribly important will be scaled back. So this one, I think, was a wrong-headed idea. There's other cuts that should be made. This is a very vulnerable region, and I'm working with our local mayors and our governor to see if we can't address that issue.
I've got tons more questions. We only have about a minute and a half left. What should I ask you?
Well, interestingly enough, what we haven't talked about, of course, is the economy and jobs. And that continues to be probably the key issue that so many Americans out there and people here in Connecticut care about. And look, the economy is recovering. It's just not recovering nearly fast enough. And this has all kinds of implications. Interesting questions. Should we be rebuilding our highways right now? We know we've got to do it. Why not do it now when that would put people to work, right? How much should we cut from the budget, right? Cut too much too fast, and that economy, that sort of hesitant recovery we have right now could turn right back around into a recession. So these are the things I think that people need to be thinking about, and I think they are thinking.
Well, they're worrying about them for sure. What about taxes, though? Should we be cutting taxes at the same time? Particularly the concern that we're not hitting the people who make the most money hard enough.
Well, in December I voted against allowing the Bush tax cuts to expire, and I took a lot of grief from that, a lot of grief on that. But you don't raise taxes in the midst of a recession, but this has to be part of the discussion. Tax reform. I mean, everybody recognizes that our tax system's a mess, right? You have corporations that are paying no taxes, and it's got to be part of the overall discussion. It's hard, honestly, to say what the Republicans are saying, which is we've got to fix the deficit and the debt, but we're not going to talk about taxes. That takes half of the equation off the table. Nobody wants to raise taxes, but it's got to be part of the discussion, particularly when you've got these loopholes that allow our corporations to pay no taxes, and these subsidies through the tax code. They're sending billions of your and my money to enormously profitable energy companies right now. That's the kind of stuff we should be looking at.
Jim Himes, we've looked at a lot, and I thank you for taking the time, and particularly giving so little sleep. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us as well. Stay tuned. The news continues.